Step back. The girl will bite. The guard's voice tore through the black marble lobby like a gunshot. Wren Calloway stood frozen in the corridor, both hands gripping the handle of her mop as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The wall clock read 11:47 at night. Her janitor shift was supposed to hold nothing more than the sound of water and the smell of damp floors. Not this. Right in the center of the main lobby of Ashford Holdings, beneath a bronze statue worth more than the apartment she lived in, a little girl sat curled on the cold floor. Soft black curls tangled around her small face, thin arms wrapped tight around her knees. Rocking, rocking, rocking. Her expression was blank, like a page no one had written on yet, but her eyes were not. They moved constantly, frantic, like two birds trapped inside a glass cage. Around her, 4 men in black suits stood helpless, each keeping at least 3 yards of distance as if they were standing back from a live bomb. A nanny in a pale uniform whispered urgently into her phone that the child was having another episode and to call Dr. Myers right now, immediately. 2 other men in dark tailored suits stood even farther away, arms folded, faces carved from stone, the kind of men accustomed to watching everything and touching nothing. A low humming sound escaped the little girl's mouth and echoed softly through the vast, empty lobby, steady and alone, nearly swallowed by the building's cold silence. But Wren heard it. She heard every note, because she had heard that sound before, in a room far darker than this one, from another child long ago. She stepped forward. The guard's arm shot out across her chest like a steel bar. That's the boss's daughter. Don't get involved. The last person who got involved disappeared the next day. No one ever saw him again. His voice dropped as his eyes flicked toward the red blinking security camera. You understand what I'm saying, don't you? Wren did not look at the camera. She did not look at the guards. She did not look at the man trying to frighten her with borrowed power. She looked only at the little girl. She watched the tiny fingers tapping against the marble in rhythm, with a melody only the child could hear. She watched the quickening breath each time a footstep came too close. She watched the small shoulders flinch when the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Wren knew. She knew the feeling of a world that was too big, too loud, too fast, and of no one, not a single soul, willing to sit down beside you. I won't talk to her, Wren said quietly, her voice calm in a way that felt almost unreal, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of stepping into the orbit of one of the most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard. I'll just sit. And she sat down, right there on the cold black marble floor, 5 steps away from the child. Still in her faded gray janitor's uniform, still in the worn sneakers she had owned for 2 years. Her sleeve slipped back slightly, revealing the edge of a long, pale scar running down her left forearm, and she pulled the fabric down quickly, an old habit as natural as breathing. She reached into her cleaning cart and took out a small bottle of dish soap, the cheapest kind from the dollar store. She dipped her finger into the mop bucket, touched a bit of soap, and lifted it to her lips. 1 bubble rose into the air, fragile and shimmering. 2, 3. They floated in the cool marble lobby, catching the light and breaking it into small rainbows. Delicate, slow, harmless. The little girl stopped rocking. Not all at once, but gradually, as if someone were turning down the volume on fear. The humming softened, softer, then disappeared. Her frantic eyes stilled and fixed on the nearest bubble, a pale blue one drifting lazily toward the ceiling like a secret refusing to fall. Wren did not look at her. She did not ask questions. She did not soothe or explain. She simply sat on the cold floor in her janitor's uniform and kept blowing bubbles. 1 burst. Another drifted higher. 1 settled briefly on the child's knee before dissolving without a sound. The guard stood stunned. The security men exchanged glances. The nanny lowered her phone, mouth slightly open. No one understood what they were witnessing. 12 of the world's leading specialists had failed this child. A psychologist from Switzerland, a behavioral therapist from Stockholm, a neurologist from Johns Hopkins, $30,000 a week. And the girl still rocked, still remained silent, still refused to meet anyone's eyes. But now a night shift janitor, armed with dish soap and mop water, was accomplishing what all that money could not buy: stillness. And above them, far above, behind one-way glass on the top floor, a man stood watching, Cale Ashford. Tall, cold, unmoving, a faint scar traced along his left temple, the mark of a bullet that should have killed him 8 years ago. His right hand still gripped the phone he had just silenced, 5 minutes earlier, a voice speaking Russian had been threatening to cut off shipments at the port of Newark. $2 million gone in a single night. He had ordered retaliation with 3 words, never even raising his voice. But now the hand holding the phone trembled. Cale Ashford, the man who controlled an empire stretching across the eastern seaboard, who crushed rivals before breakfast, whose name alone could silence an entire neighborhood, stood there watching a janitor sit on his lobby floor blowing soap bubbles for his daughter, and he could not breathe. Because the little girl below was Poppy, his daughter, his mystery, his wound that never healed. Poppy had not looked at anyone in nearly 2 years. Not at doctors, not at nannies, not even at him. But now she was looking at the bubbles, looking at the stranger's hand. And for the first time in 726 days, Poppy Ashford's eyes were still. Cale swallowed hard, his knuckles whitening against the railing. Down below, the janitor never lifted her gaze. She did not even know she was being watched. She simply sat there, quiet and patient, and blew another bubble into the air. The blue bubble rose through the light, touched the ceiling, and burst. But what it left behind, that sacred stillness between a little girl and a stranger, did not burst. Cale stepped into the elevator and pressed the lobby button. He did not know who the janitor was. He did not know why she could do what no one else had done. He did not know where the scar on her arm had come from. But he knew one thing. He would not let her leave the building tonight until he had his answers. If this story has touched your heart, please press the heart button to let us know you're here. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes love does not need a voice. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe so you won't miss the next part of this story. The elevator doors opened, and the lobby fell silent. Not an ordinary silence, but the kind that has shape and weight, the kind that happens when the air itself seems to hold its breath. The 4 men in black straightened at once as if pulled by invisible strings. The nanny lowered her head and slipped her phone behind her back. The 2 suited men stepped aside, eyes fixed on the marble floor. Wren was still sitting on the cold stone tiles, her hands damp with soap. And she noticed every one of those reactions before she ever looked at the man stepping out of the elevator. She had never seen a room full of grown adults fear a single person in quite that way. Not the startled kind of fear, the instinctive kind. The kind prey feels when it scents a predator, the kind the body understands before the mind can catch up. Her gaze flicked briefly to the brass plaque mounted on the lobby wall, the engraved letters gleaming beneath the lights. Ashford Holdings. She had heard that name on late-night news broadcasts while mopping the 12th floor, always paired with words like empire, dispute, power. She did not know exactly who Cale Ashford was, but the way the entire lobby recoiled at his arrival told her more than any broadcast ever could. He walked straight toward her. He did not look at the guards. He did not look at the nanny. He did not look at Poppy, who was now lying on her side on the floor, her half-closed eyes following the fading trail of the last bubble. He looked only at Wren, and when he spoke it was not an invitation, not a question, but a command, the kind long accustomed to obedience, before the sound had even finished leaving his mouth. Stand up. Come with me. Wren rose, not because she was afraid, but because behind the steel in this man's eyes, she recognized something else. She had seen that look in the mirror every night for years, the look of someone losing something and not knowing how to hold on to it. The elevator doors closed. Only the 2 of them remained. Wren stood near the corner, her hands still slick with soap, the cheap scent of dish liquid mingling with the expensive cologne of the man across from her. Cale Ashford was nearly a head taller than she was. The faint scar along his left temple stood out beneath the elevator's fluorescent light. And Wren noticed something else. His knuckles were calloused, the kind of calluses that did not come from a desk. She did not ask. There were things she had learned young. Do not ask about another person's scars unless you are ready to show your own. The top floor. The doors opened into an office larger than her apartment and Jonah's combined. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the entire Manhattan skyline. Dark oak. Not a single family photograph on the desk. Not one child's drawing on the walls. The room was clean, immaculate, and so empty that Wren felt cold standing inside it. Close the door, Cale said. And she did. He did not sit. He did not offer her a chair. He stood behind his desk, both hands braced against the polished wood, studying her as if trying to determine what parts she had been assembled from. Who taught you that? He asked at last. The bubble trick, the sitting still. Whatever that was downstairs. Ren met his gaze without blinking. No one taught me. I learned. From a child. She paused, weighing how much to reveal. Then she chose. Enough to answer. Not enough to bleed. My brother, Jonah. Not by blood. He was in the foster house where I volunteered when he was 4. His leg was injured. No one treated it. No one looked at him. He has sensory processing disorder. When he had an episode, I blew bubbles. With dish soap. Because we didn't have money for toys. She remembered the dark room in the foster home. Jonah at 4, curled in a corner, crying without sound because he had cried too many times and no one had come. Ren at 23, thin eyes shadowed from working 3 shifts, kneeling beside him, dipping her finger into a bowl of dishwater and blowing. One bubble rising in the dark. Jonah stopping, watching, and for the first time in weeks, falling asleep against her shoulder. I studied special education, Ren added, her voice steadier than the memory allowed. 2 years. Then the money ran out. She did not say more. She did not speak of the nights mopping mall floors to cover rent for her and Jonah. She did not mention Mrs. Harriet, the widowed woman downstairs who watched Jonah every evening while Ren worked the night shift, never taking $1 because she said every child deserves someone waiting at home. Cale remained silent while she spoke. He did not interrupt. He did not nod. He simply watched. Then he said, his voice flat as the surface of his desk, I want to hire you. To work with my daughter. Twice a week, maybe more. I will compensate you accordingly. Ren did not answer immediately. She looked around the office. At the barren desk with no family photographs. At the glass walls reflecting a Manhattan skyline glittering with billions of dollars. Then she looked back at the man who had silenced an entire lobby by his presence alone. The last time someone told me they would change my life, Ren said slowly, each word heavy as stone. I lost 3 years in hell. I don't need anyone to change my life anymore. I just needed to stop trying to kill me. The room settled into silence. Cale Ashford, whose phone call could redirect shipments worth millions in the middle of the ocean, whose single nod could determine the fate of entire families, stood there, looking at a 27-year-old janitor with soap still clinging to her hands as she refused him. And he did not know how to respond. Not because she was insolent, but because in her gray-blue eyes he saw something money could not purchase, and power could not force. Truth. The kind of truth that belongs only to those who have hit bottom and clawed their way back up with bare hands. Ren turned toward the door. Her fingers closed around the handle, but before she twisted it, she heard Cale's voice behind her, lower now, almost a whisper. Do you know my daughter's name? Ren paused. Poppy, she answered softly. I heard the nanny call her. Silence. Then Cale spoke again. And for the first time his voice did not sound like a command, but like a plea ground through clenched teeth. 726 days. She hasn't looked at anyone. Not doctors. Not nannies. Not me. Ren stood with her back to him, but she was listening. Tonight, she looked at you. Ren's hand tightened around the door handle. She did not turn back. But she did not walk away either. And in the quiet between them, inside that glass office overlooking the city that never sleeps, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a thin crack, delicate as the skin of a soap bubble, forming in a wall they had both been building for far too long. 2 days passed. 2 days in which Ren mopped floors, emptied trash bins, and pushed her cleaning cart down brightly lit corridors at midnight, and thought. She thought about the little girl's eyes going still as they followed a soap bubble. She thought about the voice of the most powerful man in the building nearly breaking when he said she looked at you. She thought about the door she had neither walked through nor fully closed. On the second night, in her small Brooklyn apartment, Ren sat on the kitchen floor beside Jonah. The 8-year-old boy was drawing, his left leg folded into the most comfortable angle his damaged knee would allow, a blue crayon moving slowly across the paper. He did not look up when he spoke. Are you going to help that girl? Ren turned the glass of water in her hands. I don't know. Why not? Because I don't know if I'm enough. Jonah stopped drawing. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, tilted his head, and began to tell his story in the soft, steady whisper Ren had heard thousands of times. The storytelling voice he used to turn the real world into something survivable. Back at the foster house, there was a stray cat living under the stairs. No one would go near it because it scratched. The adults said it was crazy. They said it should be taken away, but I put a bowl of milk 3 steps from it and sat down to wait. I didn't talk. I didn't look at it. I just sat. He looked at Ren. Every day it came one step closer. On the 7th day it slept on my leg. Silence settled between them. Then Jonah added, his voice light as if sharing a secret. That girl doesn't bite because she hates anyone. She bites because she's scared. Like the cat. Like I was. Ren looked at the boy she had pulled from the darkest corner of the foster system. The 4-year-old with an untreated leg injury no one had bothered to see. Now 8, wearing glasses, walking with a limp, and understanding fear better than any specialist money could hire. She kissed the top of his head. All right, she said. I'll go. The next morning, Ren returned to Ashford Holdings, not for the night shift. An envelope waited for her at the security desk. Inside was a new employee badge, a day schedule, her pay unchanged, plus an additional allowance she had not requested. K.L. Ashford had arranged everything in 2 days, quickly and quietly, the way a man accustomed to turning intention into reality before anyone else could object. But Ren did not go to her assigned floor. She walked straight to the elevator, pressed the button for the top level, and when the oak doors of the office opened, she stepped inside without waiting to be invited. K.L. stood by the glass wall, a phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a language Ren did not understand but recognized as dangerous. He looked at her, said 2 final words into the phone, and ended the call. You came back. Not a question, a statement. I came back, Ren replied, but I have one condition. K.L. folded his arms. Ren held his gaze. I don't work for you. I am there for Poppy, and when I'm with her, no cameras, no guards outside the door, no specialists watching from behind one-way glass with their notebooks. No one. Just me and her. K.L.'s jaw tightened. This was a man who placed cameras in every corner of his building, who kept security 24 hours a day, who controlled everything from shipping routes to his daughter's dinner menu, and now a 27-year-old janitor was asking him to surrender the one thing he believed kept him alive. Control. Do you know who I am? He asked quietly. Ren did not blink. Your daughter doesn't need to know who you are. She needs to know you're safe. Those are not the same thing. Silence. The kind long enough to hear the city murmuring 30 stories below. K.L. studied her as if calculating, weighing instinct against what he had witnessed that night in the lobby. His daughter's eyes steady for the first time in nearly 2 years. Instinct lost. All right, he said. One word. Short. Reluctant. But real. Ren nodded. She turned toward the door, took 2 steps, then paused. Without facing him, she spoke again. Mr. Ashford. What? Do you know your daughter's favorite color? Silence. Longer than before. Heavier than before. Ren glanced back just enough to see the face of the most powerful man on the eastern seaboard. And on that face, there was no anger, no pride. Only a hollow space. She recognized immediately, because she had lived with the same hollow space for 21 years before she met Jonah. The hollow space of someone who does not know how to love the very thing he loves most. Blue, Ren said softly. It always starts with blue. It calms the chaos. She walked out. The door closed with a quiet click, and K.L. Ashford stood alone in his multi-million-dollar office, surrounded by the blazing Manhattan skyline, surrounded by the empire he had built with blood and with things he never told anyone, and realized something so simple it felt almost cruel. He did not know his own daughter's favorite color. He had hired 12 specialists, flown in doctors from 3 continents, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars each month, and he did not know what color she loved. His hand rested on the oak desk in the same place as before, but this time not to brace himself in authority, only to steady himself. Because for the first time in a very long while, K.L. Ashford felt the ground beneath him shift, and what unsettled him was not an enemy, not a bullet, but a question from a janitor with soap still clinging to her hands, a woman whose last name he did not even know. K.L. Ashford's penthouse sat at the crown of the Upper East Side, and when the private elevator doors opened, Ren understood at once why Poppy did not speak. The apartment felt like a museum. White walls, glass railings, sharp edges everywhere. Not a single flower, not a single crooked pillow, not one imperfection to prove that someone truly lived there. Everything was precise. Everything was immaculate. Everything was cold. Ren stepped inside with Jonah's hand clasped tightly in hers. He limped beside her, a backpack of crayons slung over one shoulder, his eyes wide as he took it all in, not afraid, only curious in the way of a child who has lived in enough bad places to know that beautiful does not always mean safe. K.L. stood at the end of the hallway, sleeves rolled up, bare feet against the stone floor. He looked at Ren, then down at the limping boy, and something in his gaze shifted. "You brought a child. He's a bridge," Ren said, offering no further explanation. Jonah tipped his head back to look at Kale, pushed his glasses up his nose, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'll be very quiet. You won't even know I'm here." Kale did not respond, but he did not object either. He led them down the long corridor and stopped before a half-open door. "She's in there." Ren looked through the narrow opening. Poppy's room was a miniature palace, floor-to-ceiling windows, sheer white curtains, toys arranged with military precision, each doll spaced exactly a hand's width from the next, books lined up from tallest to shortest, crayons resting inside an unopened box, and in the farthest corner of the room, Poppy sat curled by the window, her forehead resting against the glass, staring out at the city as if standing watch over something only she could see. Ren did not enter immediately. She knelt to Jonah's level and whispered, "I'll go in first. You sit on the other side of the room. Don't look at her. Don't speak to her. Just be there and do what you do best." Jonah nodded. He knew exactly what his sister meant. Ren eased the door open and stepped inside without a sound, lowering herself to the floor about 10 feet from Poppy. She took a small notebook from her bag and began to draw. Slowly, without looking at the girl. 5 lines. A circle. From the circle she sketched bubbles rising above the head of a small drawn child. Jonah settled in the opposite corner, his back against the wall, his damaged leg folded in close. He did not draw. He did what he always did when the world felt too loud or too silent. He told a story. His voice was soft as breath, not directed at anyone, simply released into the air like invisible bubbles. Once upon a time there was a princess who lived in a tower made of glass. The tower was beautiful, very bright, but the glass swallowed every sound. The princess spoke, and no one heard her. She waved and no one saw. She could see everyone outside, but no one could see her. Poppy did not turn around, but she tilted her head, just slightly, a few degrees, enough for Ren to notice. The girl was listening. Ren kept drawing. Jonah kept telling his story. No one spoke to Poppy. No one looked at Poppy. No one asked her to do anything. The room held only the soft scrape of crayon on paper, the whisper of an 8-year-old boy, and the quiet presence of 2 people demanding nothing except the right to remain. 3 minutes passed. 5, 7. Then Poppy stood. Ren did not lift her head, but her heart pounded so loudly she feared the child might hear it. Poppy moved slowly, cautiously, each small step placed as delicately as a bird's, as if the floor might crack beneath her if she pressed too hard. She walked past Ren, paused, and picked up the drawing of the bubbles. She looked at it. Then she continued across the room to Jonah and stood beside him, listening to one more line of the story, and then Poppy Ashford sat down, directly between Ren and Jonah, precisely in the middle, as if she had measured the distance herself. She did not speak. She did not look at either of them, but she chose to sit there. Outside the half-open door, Cale Ashford stood motionless. One hand covered his mouth. His eyes were wide as he looked through the narrow opening at a sight he had not believed he would ever see again. His daughter sitting beside someone by her own choice. Not a doctor paid $30,000 a week. Not a neurologist flown in from Johns Hopkins. A janitor and a limping boy telling a fairy tale to the air. 15 minutes later, Ren stepped quietly out of the room. She eased the door nearly closed, leaving Jonah inside still whispering, now telling the part where the glass princess discovers a small crack in the tower wall. Cale waited in the hallway, his arms crossed, though his posture had changed, less defensive, more uncertain. "She drew with you," he said, as if needing to hear himself confirm it. "No," Ren answered gently. "She sat with us. She started the conversation." Cale frowned. She didn't say a word. Ren looked at him, and in her eyes there was something both patient and sad. The look of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to hear what made no sound. Speaking and communicating are not the same thing, Mr. Ashford. Before the doorbell rang that morning, Cale Ashford had already given an order that could cost 3 men their lives. The closed room, 1 level below the penthouse, had no windows and no cameras, only a steel table and 2 chairs. Frank Mercer sat across from him, 50 years old, a face carved from stone, thick hands resting calmly on the metal surface with the composure of a man who had cleaned up more bodies than houses. The screen in front of them displayed surveillance images from the port of Newark. 3 Ashford trucks blocked. Cargo containers empty. Drivers forced to their knees on the concrete. Volkov, Frank said. 2 million in one night. He's testing our response. Kale looked at the screen. He did not frown. He did not clench his fists. He simply watched with the eyes Frank had seen hundreds of times over 15 years. Eyes that calculated faster than speech. Send a message, Kale said. His voice did not rise or fall. It was flat as water before a storm. No words. Frank nodded, stood, and left the room without asking another question. He did not need to ask. 15 years beside Kale Ashford had taught him exactly what no words meant. Alone in the sealed room, Kale stepped to the small sink in the corner. Cold water ran over his fingers. He lifted his head and studied his reflection in the mirror, the scar running along his left temple, the fatigue in his own eyes. And he wondered for the 1000th time whether that face resembled his father's, the man shot dead outside a grocery store in Brownsville when Kale was 12, or resembled Declan, the crime boss who had lifted him from the street and shaped him into what he had become. The penthouse doorbell rang. He shut off the water, dried his hands, and 5 minutes after ordering retaliation, Kale Ashford stood in his penthouse kitchen pouring water into 2 crystal glasses for a janitor and her limping younger brother. Wren accepted the glass and looked around. It was her second time in the penthouse, but the first time she had stood in the kitchen. It was large and spotless, and clearly seldom used. No magnets on the refrigerator, no coffee stains, no scent of cooking. She set the glass down without drinking. The last time we spoke, you said you hired 12 specialists for Poppy, Wren said. Kale leaned back against the counter, his palms braced behind him. More than that, a psychologist from Switzerland at $30,000 a week, a behavioral expert from Stockholm, a neurologist from Johns Hopkins. I flew them in, put them in 5-star suites, gave them full access, and none of them made her look. Wren tapped her finger lightly against the stone countertop. You hired a lot of people to talk to her. But who listened? Kale straightened. I listen. I rearranged my entire life for her. I canceled meetings, moved schedules, fired nannies, built a soundproof room, installed special lighting. You changed the schedule, Wren interrupted, her voice not loud but sharp. But did you change your heart? Silence followed. Not the angry kind, the kind that comes when someone names a truth you do not want spoken. Kale turned toward the window. Morning light cut across the kitchen floor and cast his shadow long and sharp. She used to talk, he said quietly, as if reminding himself. 3 years old. She babbled all day, pointed at everything and named it. Red, blue, bird. She laughed when she saw pigeons outside the window, laughed so hard she fell backward onto the floor. He stopped. Then one day, nothing. No talking, no pointing, no laughing, like someone flipped a switch. Wren did not interrupt. My wife left 3 months after that. The words fell into the kitchen heavy as stone. Kale did not look at her as he continued. Camille, she said she did not sign up for this life. Said she needed space. Said she would come back when things were better. He gave a short laugh without humor. Things did not get better, and she did not come back. Poppy knows, Wren said gently. Kale turned toward her. Knows what? That her mother left. She remembers. Wren paused, then added, The first time I came here, when the nanny walked past Poppy's room, she flinched. I thought it was the sound of footsteps. It wasn't. It was the sound of high heels. Kale went still. Then he spoke slowly. Camille was wearing high heels the day she left. Poppy was sitting on the floor watching her mother roll a suitcase to the door. The sound of heels on marble was the last thing she heard before the door closed. You knew that, Wren said. It was not a question. I banned high heels in the penthouse the following week, he replied. He said it flatly, like a building regulation. But Wren heard what lay beneath. He watched his daughter. He noticed. He understood that the sound triggered her panic, and he removed it quietly, without explanation, without recognition. He loved her the way he knew how, by controlling variables, eliminating threats, building walls, but he did not know how to sit down. Wren was about to speak when small footsteps in the hallway interrupted her. Jonah appeared at the kitchen entrance, holding a drawing, his eyes bright behind his glasses. Wren, he whispered, as if guarding a secret. I drew this for Poppy, but only if she wants it. He held up the page. 3 figures holding hands, one small with glasses, one with long hair, one with wide eyes. Above them, a bubble. And below, in uneven blue crayon letters written by an 8-year-old child, the words, "Home is when no one leaves." Cale looked at the drawing. He said nothing, but his hand tightened around the glass until his knuckles blanched white, and Wren saw his jaw lock as if he were holding something inside, refusing to let it escape through his mouth. She understood, because those words were not only written for Poppy, they were written for every child who had ever sat on the floor watching someone roll a suitcase out the door, including the 12-year-old boy in Brownsville, who had stood on a sidewalk outside a grocery store, staring at his father's body and understanding that his father would never be coming home. By the 3rd week, Wren spread an old picnic blanket across the floor of Poppy's room, a faded plaid one she had carried from their Brooklyn apartment, soft and worn, holding the familiar scent of home rather than the sterile air of the penthouse. Jonah arranged the food the way they had practiced the night before. Grapes cut in halves, small squares of cheese, plain crackers, everything soft, everything bite-sized, nothing hot, no sauce, nothing that might assault the senses of a child for whom the world was always too loud, too bright, too much. Wren set a small Bluetooth speaker at the edge of the blanket and pressed play. Debussy, Clair de Lune. The piano drifted into the room slowly and gently, like water poured into a glass without disturbing the surface. Poppy sat in her usual place by the window, but today something was different. She was not facing the glass. She was facing the blanket. Jonah settled at the edge, his back against the bed frame, and began his story. His voice was soft as breath, steady, not directed at anyone, simply released into the air as always. The glass princess found a magic pencil. It was very small, no bigger than her little finger. But whatever she drew became real. She drew a bird, and the bird flew out from the glass wall. She drew a sun, and the tower felt warm for the first time. She drew a door, and the door appeared in a wall that had once been nothing but glass. Poppy listened, and at the same time, she picked up a crayon and began to color. Wren saw it, and her heart began to pound so hard she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from reacting. Poppy was listening to Jonah's story and coloring at the same time. 2 actions at once. The first time. In 3 weeks she had only done one thing at a time, either listening, or drawing, or rocking, or staring out the window. Never together. But today Jonah's voice held one half of her mind, and the crayon held the other, and the two halves did not collide. They coexisted. It was a kind of progress 12 specialists, and hundreds of thousands of dollars had never reached. Wren said nothing. She quietly slid the blue crayon closer to Poppy than any other color in the room. Blue first. Always begin with blue. In the doorway, Cale stood watching. Wren had known he was there, but today his posture was different. His arms were not crossed. He was not leaning against the frame like an observer. His hands were pressed against his chest, fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. And Wren understood. He was not guarded. He was afraid. Afraid to hope. Afraid that if he allowed himself to believe what he was seeing, it would be taken from him the way everything else in his life had been taken. His father taken outside a grocery store. His childhood taken by Declan. Camille taken. His daughter's voice taken. Cale Ashford feared hope more than bullets. Poppy finished a wide stretch of blue. Then she reached for another crayon. She drew 3 figures. The first small with glasses. The second taller with long hair. The third tallest of all, with a line across the face in the exact place of a scar along the left temple. Jonah kept telling the story. Wren remained silent, but both of them saw. Poppy picked up a red crayon. She colored the shirt of the third figure red. Carefully, slowly, stroke by stroke, Cale stepped into the room. No one invited him, but his feet moved before his mind could order them to stop. He stopped 2 steps from the blanket and looked down at the drawing. His voice came out rough. Red. That used to be her mother's favorite color. Poppy paused. The red crayon rested between her small fingers. She did not look up immediately. The room held its breath. Even Jonah stopped mid-sentence, the fairy tale suspended in the air. Then Poppy lifted her head. She did not look at Wren. She did not look at Jonah. She looked at Cale, straight into her father's eyes. And in the smallest voice a human being can make, softer than breath, softer than a leaf falling, softer than a soap bubble bursting on her knee that night in the lobby, Poppy Ashford whispered 2 words. Still is. Cale's knees gave way. Not slowly. Not with control. The backs of his legs struck the edge of the bed and he sank down, one hand covering his mouth, breath leaving him in a tremor like a string pulled too tight and suddenly released. His eyes were wide as he looked at his daughter, at the drawing of 3 figures, at the red shirt on the one marked with a scar, and tears did not fall but hovered there, bright at the rim, catching the late afternoon light spilling through the windows. Poppy said nothing more. She lowered her head and continued coloring, the red crayon moving steadily across the page, as if she had just spoken the most important truth of her life, and could now return to the second most important thing, color. Wren did not move. Jonah reached beneath the blanket and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back, because both of them understood. Poppy had not only remembered her mother's favorite color, she had kept it. Through nearly 2 years of silence, through everything she had closed off and retreated from, she had carried that red inside her like a candle shielded in a storm. Still is. 2 words holding nearly 2 years of quiet, nearly 2 years of waiting, nearly 2 years that 12 leading specialists had tried to unlock without understanding that the key was not method, not money, but an old blanket, a fairy tale, and the steady presence of people who asked for nothing but the right to remain. That night the children fell asleep in Poppy's room. Jonah curled on a beanbag chair, Poppy in her bed with the red crayon still in her hand. Wren stepped into the hallway and found KL there, leaning against the wall, holding 2 cups of hot tea. He handed one to her. "She said red," he murmured. "She hasn't labeled anything in more than 2 years." "She didn't label it," Wren replied softly, taking the cup. "She remembered it. That's different." KL looked at her. His eyes were unlike any she had seen before. Not cold, not calculating, not controlled. Just a father looking at the woman who had helped his daughter whisper for the first time in 726 days, unable to find words large enough for what he was feeling. "In my world," KL said slowly, each word weighed before release. "Silence usually means someone is about to die." He paused and met her gaze. But today, her silence meant someone is about to live. Wren did not ask what he meant by my world. She did not need to. She had seen the way the lobby bowed when he stepped from the elevator. She had seen the calluses on his knuckles. She had noticed the windowless room 1 level down that he believed she did not know about. She understood he was more than the chief executive whose name shone on the building, but she also understood that the man standing before her now, holding a cup of tea, eyes red from tears he would not allow to fall, was not a kingpin. He was simply a father who had heard his daughter speak after nearly 2 years, and he was trembling. The children were asleep. Jonah curled on the beanbag chair in Poppy's room, blanket tucked beneath his chin, his glasses resting on the nightstand beside the red crayon. Poppy still held even in sleep. The penthouse settled into silence, the particular kind that comes only when children are sleeping, and the adults are left unsure what to do with the space their small bodies no longer fill. Wren stepped out onto the balcony. October wind moved in from the river, cool enough to remind her that winter was coming and that her only coat was thinner than it had been last year. She leaned back against the railing and looked out at the Manhattan skyline. Millions of lit windows scattered like sugar across black velvet, and thought that the city was far more beautiful from 30 stories up than it was from a subway platform at 3 in the morning. The glass door slid open behind her. Cale stepped out carrying 2 cups, not tea this time, but black coffee, hot, and he handed one to her without asking if she wanted it. They stood side by side in silence. Not close, not distant, just far enough apart that the wind did not carry one person's warmth to the other. Wren took a sip and the wind strengthened. She lifted her left hand to brush her hair from her face, and her sleeve slipped down. The scar, long, pale, running from her wrist nearly to her elbow, stark against her skin in the yellow light spilling from the living room. She realized a second too late. She pulled the sleeve back down in a reflex, so familiar she did not have to think, but it was too late. KL had seen. He did not speak immediately. He did not stare at her. Instead, he raised his own hand and traced the scar along his left temple, his finger moving slowly over the ridge the bullet had carved 8 years earlier, as if offering his wound before asking about hers. "Mine was a bullet," he said quietly. 8 years ago, the man was 3 yards away. I turned my head at the right second. It grazed instead of went through. He lowered his hand. "Yours." Wren looked into her coffee. Steam blurred in the cold air. She could lie. She could say bicycle accident, kitchen mishap. Any of the stories she had given 100 times to 100 people who asked. But this man had just pointed to a bullet scar without blinking, so she did not blink either. A broken bottle, she said. Foster father. 14. Cale said nothing. He simply watched her, and in that quiet, Ren began to speak, not because she wanted to, but because for the first time in 27 years, she stood beside someone marked by damage and did not feel the need to justify why she had survived. I entered foster care at 6, 4 families. The first forgot to feed me breakfast. The second was kinder but moved away after 7 months. The third, she paused, and her fingers brushed lightly at the fabric covering the scar beneath. The foster father drank. Every night. Most nights he only sat and drank, but some nights he did not sit. The wind moved around them. Manhattan glittered below. Indifferent. That night I was 14. He was more drunk than usual. A new child had come to the house, 4 years old, crying without stopping. He stood up and walked toward him, and I recognized that look. I stepped in front. He picked up a bottle. She delivered the next words with a calm so steady it was almost unreal, the kind that belongs only to someone who has told the story to herself enough times that it no longer bleeds, only scars. The bottle shattered on my arm. I grabbed the boy and ran outside, blood from elbow to wrist. A neighbor called the police. In the report, they wrote that I had a history of violence because I pushed him down while pulling the child away. She let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. At 15, I ran from the next placement, slept in subway stations, under bridges, shelters when there was space. At 16, I worked 3 jobs and rented a room in Bushwick, the size of a closet, the kind where if I lay down both shoulders touched the walls. At 23, I went back into the system, not to stay but to volunteer. That's where I met Jonah, 4 years old, a leg injured long before, never treated, walking crooked, sitting in the darkest corner of the room, not crying, not speaking, just staring at the wall. I sat beside him and said the words no one had ever said to me. I'm not going anywhere. She paused. At 20, I enrolled in special education. 2 years. Ran out of money. No loans. I left. There was a woman, Ren continued, her voice softening as if touching something fragile. Mrs. Lena. At the second foster home she cooked, the only one who looked at me like a child instead of a case file. She used to say something I never forgot. Ren kept her eyes on the skyline. Don't raise your voice. Lower your body. She swallowed. Mrs. Lena died when I was 17. I never got to say goodbye. Silence stretched long between them. The Manhattan wind carried distant horns and the restless pulse of a city they both belonged to and yet never truly did. My father was shot in front of me when I was 12, Cale said quietly, outside a grocery store in Brownsville. I was 3 steps away. I saw everything. He drank from his cup. A man named Declan Ashford picked me up from the street, raised me, taught me, made me his heir. I did not choose this world. It chose me before I was old enough to understand what I was losing. He paused. A long pause. Then he continued, each word deliberate. I killed my first man at 22. I am not proud of it, but I will not pretend it did not happen. Ren did not step back. She did not flinch. She did not alter the way she stood. She looked at him, at the scar along his temple, at the eyes she had first seen cold as steel in the lobby that night, but which now were open in a way she suspected very few people had ever witnessed. You are the first person with scars like mine who does not try to hide them, she said. Cale looked at her for a long moment. The wind lifted her hair, and he saw the way she stood straight, shoulders steady. Beside him on a balcony, 30 stories high, without trembling. Though she knew what he was, knew what his hands had done, and still remained. Mrs. Lena was right, he said. Lower your body. Perhaps that is why Poppy trusts you. Because you know how to kneel lower than someone else's pain. Ren offered a small smile. And you are learning. Cale turned his gaze back to Manhattan, the city glittering vast and indifferent beneath them. Very slowly, he said. Ren stood in front of the mirror in her Brooklyn bathroom and studied the only shirt she owned that was still intact. A white long-sleeved blouse with a simple round collar, bought at a thrift store 2 years earlier for $3. Not torn, not stained, just a little thin at the elbows. It was the best she had for her first dinner at Cale Ashford's penthouse. She tugged the sleeves down carefully, making sure the scar was covered, then turned toward Jonah. He stood in the doorway with his backpack of crayons slung over one shoulder, holding a folded sheet of paper he had spent the entire afternoon drawing. "Menu," he announced, lifting it with bright eyes behind his glasses. "I made a menu for Poppy." Ren looked at the paper. Crayon drawings in the uneven lines of an 8-year-old showed smiling foods: grapes with round eyes, bread with little jumping legs, a sweet potato wearing a crown. She smiled, kissed the top of his head, and together they left the apartment. When the penthouse door opened, Ren stopped short. The dining room had changed. The long conference-style table she had seen the first night, the kind that seated 12 people without requiring any of them to see one another's faces, was gone. In its place stood a small round table with 4 chairs and a simple cloth. The fluorescent ceiling lights were dark, replaced by the soft glow of 2 lamps and a single candle in the center. On the kitchen counter, Kale's phone lay face down and silent. Kale stood barefoot in the kitchen, sleeves rolled as always inside the penthouse. He watched Ren take in the room, and for a fleeting moment she saw something on his face that looked very much like worry. The worry of a man attempting something for the first time and unsure whether he had done it right. "I changed the table," he said, a little stiffly, as if delivering a report. "I can see that," Ren replied. She did not say more, but she understood. He had listened, not with his ears, but in the way he had listened to the sound of high heels and banned them, the way he now looked at the cold length of a conference table and replaced it with a circle. He loved through action. It was only that his actions had always been too large, too distant, more like building walls than opening doors. Poppy was already seated, hands folded in her lap, a blue crayon tucked between her fingers like a small anchor she would not release. When Jonah sat beside her, he opened his hand-drawn menu and laid it between them. "Tonight's menu," he whispered with formal gravity. He pointed to each picture. "This is Sir Grape. He's a little sour but very cheerful. And this is Princess Sweet Potato. She's soft and warm and never shouts. And this is Night Cheese. He's square and reliable." Poppy studied the page, and she smiled. Small, thin, almost invisible, but there. The corners of her mouth lifted at the story of a limping boy turning dinner into a fairy tale. The food was set out. Soft. No sauce. No heat. Grapes cut in halves. Small cubes of cheese. Roasted sweet potato in neat pieces. Plain crackers. Poppy's plate and Jonah's were identical. Same items, same arrangement, same portions, because Ren knew sameness meant safety, meant predictability, meant one less thing for Poppy's senses to manage. The first few minutes were quiet. The candle flickered. No Debussy tonight. Only the small sound of Jonah chewing and the light tap of Ren's fork against her plate. Poppy sat still, looking at the food, blue crayon still in hand. Then Jonah swallowed a bite of cheese and asked in the gentlest voice he could manage, "Poppy, after dinner do you want to color?" No answer. Her gaze lowered to her plate, to the soft piece of sweet potato, small, plain, harmless. Jonah waited. Ren waited. Kale waited, his fork suspended in midair, eyes fixed on his daughter. Then Poppy reached out. Small fingers closed around the sweet potato. She lifted it to her mouth, and she ate. Ren froze. Her whole body stilled as if someone had pressed pause, fork hovering, lips parted, watching the 5-year-old chew slowly as though it were the most ordinary act in the world, when to everyone else at that table it was a miracle. Kale stopped breathing, literally. His chest did not rise. His knuckles whitened around the fork. His eyes widened as he watched his daughter. Jonah grinned, bright and unguarded, as if he had no idea that this moment could break 2 adults open. "Same," he declared, holding up his own piece. "We're eating the same thing." Ren leaned toward Kale and whispered low enough that only he could hear. "She didn't eat this morning, did she?" Kale shook his head, jaw tight. "Not yesterday either. She's choosing this moment," Ren murmured. "Choosing this company, choosing this quiet." Dinner continued. Slow, quiet. Poppy ate another grape, then a piece of cheese. Each bite a small miracle no one dared name for fear that naming it might make it vanish. At the end of the meal, Poppy set down her crayon. She reached out and touched Jonah's hand. Kale flinched in his chair. Ren lifted her palm toward him in a silent signal. "It's all right. Don't move." Poppy looked at Jonah, at Ren, then at Kale, and she said clearly, gently, beautifully, "Blue." Kale dropped his fork. The metal struck marble and rang in the silence like a bell. Jonah looked at Poppy, then at Ren, and whispered with the quiet understanding of a child who has known long stretches of silence. She speaks in colors. That's how she feels safe. Cale looked at his daughter. Then he did something Ren did not expect. He rose, walked to the counter, took a napkin, and the blue crayon Poppy had set down. With the same hands that had held a gun, signed orders that cost lives, gripped a bottle in a sealed room with Frank Mercer. Cale Ashford drew a blue bubble on the napkin. Clumsy, crooked, so misshapen Jonah had to bite his lip not to laugh. He placed the napkin in front of Poppy. She studied the awkward bubble drawn by her father. Then she picked up the crayon, leaned down, and drew another bubble beside his. Rounder, smoother, but beside it. For the first time, Poppy Ashford responded directly to her father. Not through doctors. Not through specialists. Not through one-way glass or notebooks. Simply with a blue crayon on a napkin, at a candlelit table, beside a limping boy who was smiling and a janitor whose hands were still rough from dish soap. Ren glanced at Cale. His eyes were red, not crying, but shining at the rim as always, as though he had forgotten how to let tears fall the day he stood outside a grocery store in Brownsville. Dinner ended slowly. The children moved to the living room, Jonah telling a story, Poppy listening beside him with a crayon in hand. Ren washed dishes. Cale stood beside her drying them. No words, just drying. Then Poppy looked up from her half-finished drawing at the 4 figures in the room with a candle and a round table and no glowing phone screens. And she said 2 words no one had dared hope to hear. Dinner again. Ren stopped washing. Cale stopped drying. Jonah beamed. Next Friday. Poppy smiled. And that white, glass, sharp-edged penthouse, cold for so many years, carried for the first time in a very long while the scent of something no money in the world could construct but a round table, a candle, and 4 people without shared blood could create. The scent of home. The closed room, 1 level below the penthouse, had no windows. A steel table. 2 chairs. Frank Mercer was already seated when Cale walked in, and this time the screen in front of them did not show the Port of Newark. It showed Ren. Security stills from the parking garage. Ren stepping out of a taxi, her hand wrapped around Jonah's, the boy limping at her side, a backpack of crayons over his shoulder. Next image, the 2 of them entering the private elevator. Next, Ren sitting on the floor of Poppy's room, while Jonah told a story in the corner and Poppy sat between them. Next, dinner, the round table, the candle, 4 figures. Cale studied the images. His jaw tightened slowly, like a bolt being turned. Who took these? Building cameras, Frank replied evenly. Ours. That isn't the problem. The problem is if Volkov ever gets them. He swiped to the final image. Ren smiling. Poppy beside her. Jonah holding up his handmade menu. Candlelight flickering. A family scene. Warm. And to a man like Volkov, it was a target. She has no one, Frank said. No family. No relatives. No lawyer. No one who would ask questions if she disappeared. The boy even less. Volkov doesn't have these images. But if he does, she's the easiest leverage he's ever seen. Cale did not look at Frank. He looked at Ren. At the way she smiled at Poppy. At the way her hand rested lightly on Jonah's back. At the way she sat on the floor without invitation, as if she had been born to sit beside children the world forgot. Protect her, Cale said. Frank shook his head slowly. The best way to protect her is to cut her loose. Clean. Quiet. She goes back to night shifts and mops floors and lives her life. No one ever knows she stepped inside this building. I said protect her, and I said the safest protection is distance. Silence stretched between them, the kind Frank knew not to prolong, yet he did. You're not hearing me, so I'll speak to her myself. Cale looked at him for the first time since entering the room. His eyes were cold, but Frank Mercer had faced that look for 15 years, and did not step back. He rose, buttoned his jacket, and left before Cale could speak again. Frank found Ren on the 12th floor during her morning shift, mopping the corridor near the janitor's closet. She recognized him immediately. The stone-faced man she had glimpsed that first night in the lobby beside Cale, the type who never stood in front but always stood where decisions were made. He approached slowly, a brown envelope in his hand, and stopped 2 steps away. Ren Calloway, he said. Not a question. Frank Mercer. I work with Mr. Ashford, and you need to understand a few things. Ren set the mop aside. I'm listening. Frank opened the envelope. Inside was a thin file, but thick enough to destroy a life. He pulled out the first page and read without looking down. Clearly memorized. Wren Calloway. Entered foster care at 6. 4 placements. 3rd placement. Documented domestic violence. Age 15. File notes history of aggression. Pushed guardian to the ground. He looked up. On paper, you have a violent history. I pushed him because he was hitting a 4-year-old, Wren said calmly. The file doesn't mention that. The file doesn't need to. It only needs enough for a judge to raise an eyebrow. Frank withdrew the next sheet. Jonah Calloway, 8 years old, currently residing with you. No formal guardianship, no court order, no legal documentation establishing you as his guardian. Wren straightened. Her spine hardened as if steel had been threaded through it. 1 phone call, Frank said, closing the file. A single call to Child Protective Services and the boy goes back into the system. You know that system. You lived in it. The blow was not aimed at Wren. It was aimed at Jonah. And Frank knew exactly where to strike. Because for 15 years, he had cleared obstacles for Cale Ashford, and he understood that the weakest point in any human being was not their own heart, but the heart of the person they loved most. Wren went pale. The blood drained from her face so quickly she felt the hallway tilt. Jonah. The 4-year-old in the dark corner. The boy she had promised never to leave. The boy she woke at 5 each morning to work 3 shifts for. And now a phone call could return him to the place she had dragged him from. But Wren Calloway was not new to threats. She had been threatened by hands heavier than Frank Mercer's words. She had slept on concrete while other children slept in beds. She had stood up after every fall, not because she was strong, but because she had no other option. She inhaled, exhaled, and met Frank Mercer's eyes. I've lived in dangerous worlds since before I could read, she said, her voice steady, each word carved clean. Paper doesn't scare me, but I won't let your fear decide that little girl's future. Frank regarded her for a long moment. No anger, no admiration, just assessment, as though calculating the next move of a chess piece. 48 hours, he said. Think carefully. He turned and walked away, his steps measured, unhurried. The sound of his shoes on stone like a clock beginning to count down. That night in the Brooklyn apartment, Wren lay beside Jonah. He was asleep, breath even, injured leg tucked under the blanket, glasses resting on the pillow near his head. She studied his face in the glow of streetlight filtering through thin curtains, the small callus on his finger from gripping crayons. The way even in sleep he faced her as if afraid that if he turned away she might vanish. She looked at the scar along her arm. Broken bottle. 14 years old. She had shielded a child she did not know, and carried that scar ever since. Now she was shielding Poppy. But this time the cost might be Jonah. Am I being selfish? She wondered. Am I helping Poppy because she needs me, or because I need to be needed? Am I putting Jonah in danger because I refuse to step back? Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. A message from Cale. Poppy drew you today. You had wings. Wren stared at the glowing words in the dark, and then she cried, soundlessly, tears slipping into her pillow beside Jonah's steady breathing, beneath the faint Manhattan light leaking through the curtains. Not tears of joy, not tears of sorrow, tears because a 5-year-old girl had drawn her with wings, and she did not know whether those wings were strong enough to lift, or only beautiful enough to fall. Wren called at 6 in the morning. Cale answered on the second ring, as if he had been holding the phone all night. I can't continue. Her voice did not shake. It was worse than that. It was flat, the flatness of someone who has already cried, and now has only bare truth left. I don't have credentials. I don't have family. On paper, I have a history of violence. I don't even have legal guardianship of the child I'm raising. 1 phone call and Jonah goes back into the system. 1 phone call, Mr. Ashford. Silence. Then Cale spoke quietly. Frank met with you. Not a question. Don't blame him, Wren said. He's right. I'm the weak point. If someone wants to hurt you through me, they have ammunition. And the first bullet won't be aimed at me. It'll be aimed at Jonah. Wren, I don't deserve to be near Poppy. Not because I don't want to be, because I'm not enough. She ended the call before he could answer. Because if he said one more word, she would change her mind. And she had no right to change her mind when the cost could be Jonah. The penthouse that morning was silent in a way Cale had never heard before. Not the familiar silence Poppy lived inside every day. This was empty silence. In Poppy's room, crayons lay untouched on the floor, blank paper, the Bluetooth speaker dark, no Debussy, No Jonah whispering about a glass princess. No faded plaid blanket. No Wren. Poppy sat in her corner, knees drawn to her chest, rocking. The low humming returned, steady, alone, exactly as it had been that first night in the lobby, as if the last 3 weeks had never happened. The nanny tried to enter. Poppy covered her ears. Dr. Myers called. Cale listened, nodded, hung up, and ignored every piece of advice. Instead, he did the one thing Wren had taught him. He sat down on the floor, for the first time without Wren there to guide him. No Jonah telling stories. No one but him and his daughter, and the vast silence between them. He sat 3 yards away. He did not speak. He did not look directly at her. He simply remained. When he tried to say her name, she clamped her hands over her ears, so he stopped speaking. He sat. 5 minutes. 10, 20, 30. His knees ached against the cold stone. His back stiffened. He did not move. 45 minutes. Poppy lowered her hands. The rocking slowed. The humming faded. She turned her head and looked at her father. The Man 12 specialists had never taught to sit still, but a janitor had, and in her eyes was something Cale had never seen directed toward him. Trust. Poppy stood, small steps like a bird's. She walked to him and leaned her head against his shoulder. For the first time in her 5 years of life, ever. Cale did not move, did not breathe, did not raise his arms for fear any motion would shatter something more fragile than a soap bubble. Her dark curls brushed his neck. Her small warmth seeped through his shirt. And Cale Ashford, who had killed his first man at 22, who issued retaliation in 3 quiet words, who did not cry when a bullet grazed his temple, wept, not loudly. Tears ran down his face and onto his shoulder, silent and hot, and more than he knew he had been holding for how many years. 11 that night. Brooklyn. A knock at the door. Wren sat on the kitchen floor, eyes swollen. A glass of cold water in her hands. She was not expecting anyone. Jonah was asleep. She opened the door. Cale Ashford stood in the dim hallway. Black coat, hair disordered, eyes red. No bodyguards, no driver waiting, just him. Poppy leaned her head on me tonight, he said hoarsely, the first time in her life. Wren gripped the door frame. You taught me to sit down. You taught me to stay. You taught me to be quiet long enough for my daughter to believe I would not disappear. He looked at her. And now you want to leave. I'm afraid of losing Jonah. You don't understand. I do, Cale said. More than you think. I almost lost Poppy every day for 2 years, and all I did was throw money at the problem and hope someone better than me would save her. He stepped closer. I will fix the guardianship for Jonah. Legally, cleanly, tomorrow. The best lawyer. Not the kind I usually use. The kind judges trust. Why? Wren asked, her voice breaking. Because for the first time in my life, Cale said, I want to protect someone without violence. Wren looked at him, at the red in his eyes, at the way he stood in a worn Brooklyn hallway, a man who controlled an empire across the eastern seaboard, standing there without guards, without weapons, with nothing but a promise, and for the first time looking exactly like what he was trying to become, an ordinary man asking another ordinary person not to walk away. She did not say yes, but she opened the door wider, and he understood. The next morning, the closed room, steel table, 2 chairs. Cale was already seated when Frank entered. From today forward, Cale said without greeting, Wren Calloway and Jonah Calloway are under level 1 protection, like Poppy, like me. Frank stood still. She is not a weakness, Cale continued. She is the reason I still want to hold on to any of this. He glanced around the sealed room, the steel table, the blank walls, 15 years of power and violence and control. Without her, what am I holding it for? Frank was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke carefully. Declan would never have allowed this. Declan is dead, Cale replied, and I am not him. Frank studied him, longer than usual. In the eyes of the man 20 years younger, Frank Mercer saw Declan Ashford for the first time in years. Not the Declan of territory and blood, but the early Declan who had lifted a 12-year-old boy from a Brownsville sidewalk and said, From now on, you're mine. The same certainty, the same immovable force, directed somewhere new. Frank nodded, not out of fear, out of respect. He turned, stepped into the corridor, and pulled out his phone. Add 2 names to level 1 protection. Ren Calloway and Jonah Calloway, direct order from the boss, effective immediately. He ended the call and stood alone in the hallway, staring at the closed door behind him. Then he murmured, low enough for no one to hear, heavy enough to bend the air. The last time he protected someone like this, that person still ended up dead. Ren returned to the penthouse the next day, and Poppy was waiting in her usual place by the window, but this time she was not turned toward the glass. She was facing the door, waiting. When Ren stepped in with Jonah, Poppy did not run forward, did not rise, but she lifted her blue crayon and began to draw, as if she had been holding her breath for a full day and was only now allowed to exhale. That afternoon, the old plaid blanket lay across the floor again. Jonah told his story from his familiar corner, his whisper guiding the glass princess into a new land where flowers grew out of paintings and birds sang in colors. Ren sat beside Poppy, drawing quietly. Kale sat on the floor with his back against the bed, legs stretched out, fingers stained with crayon. He had sat on the floor every day since the moment Poppy leaned her head against his shoulder. Still awkward, still unsure, but present. Poppy finished covering most of the page in blue. Then she stopped. She looked at the crayon box. Her hand hovered over the rows of color, as if weighing something more important than choice. Then her small fingers pulled out a yellow crayon. Ren felt her heart stumble. Poppy had never used yellow. Blue was safety. Red was memory. Yellow was new territory. Poppy drew a small streak of light in the corner of the page. Neat. Contained. Like sunlight slipping through a crack in a door that had once known only dark. Ren asked gently, her voice careful as glass. What is that, Poppy? The girl studied the yellow mark, then looked at Ren, then spoke, clear and steady. A single word held captive for nearly 2 years until this moment. Hope. Ren's throat closed. Heat rose behind her eyes and she lowered her gaze so Poppy would not see the tears forming, because she knew if she cried now, the child might think she had done something wrong. Kale, hands smeared blue and red, looked at the small yellow streak against the sea of blue. His voice came rough, stripped of armor. That's right, sweetheart. 3 words. That's right, sweetheart. Poppy returned to her drawing as though she had revealed the greatest secret of her life, and could now rest. That night, for the first time, Ren and Jonah stayed over. Kale had arranged the small sitting room beside Poppy's bedroom with a pull-out sofa, blankets, pillows, a warm lamp. Jonah lay under the covers, glasses on the nightstand beside a fresh pad of paper, and a new box of crayons Kale had bought him. 64 colors, the kind Ren had never been able to afford. Ren sat on the edge of the bed, tucking the blanket around him, brushing his hair back. Jonah closed his eyes, then opened them again. Ren. Yes, Bug, if you stay here with Mr. KL. He paused, swallowed, eyes fixed on the ceiling because it was easier than looking at her. Will you still need me? Ren felt something inside her shatter. Not crack, shatter. Like the bottle against her arm at 14, only this time from the inside out. She knelt beside the bed, took his hands, and held his gaze until he met hers. Bug, listen to me. I found you in the darkest, dirtiest, loneliest room I have ever stepped into. You were 4, your leg hurt. No one saw you. I sat down next to you and I chose you. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. She squeezed his hands tighter. Nothing in this world changes that. Not money, not penthouses, not anyone. Do you hear me? Jonah swallowed tears. Promise. Promise. You were my home before anyone else was anything. He cried then, quietly, tears soaking the pillow. Ren leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, the two of them lying there in silence in a billionaire's penthouse neither of them belonged to, trying with everything they had to belong to each other first. In the hallway, Kale paused. He had not meant to listen. He had only walked past, but Ren's voice was low and full of something he recognized. He stood against the wall, eyes wet, hands clenched at his sides. He understood then. Ren was not only the gentle woman who blew soap bubbles on a marble floor. She was a warrior. She had fought her entire life, not with guns or power, but with something stronger. A promise to a child who was not her blood, that she would never leave. And she had kept it. Every day, every night shift, every $3 meal, every worn pair of shoes. Kept it. In the pocket of Kale's coat rested the completed guardianship papers for Jonah. Legitimate, clean, a reputable attorney, just as he had promised. Ren Calloway's name printed where it should have been years ago. He had kept his word too. The next morning, Ren woke on the sofa with Jonah curled beside her. Soft footsteps approached. She opened her eyes. Poppy stood there in white pajamas, holding an extra blanket she had dragged from her own bed. She said nothing. Carefully, she spread it over Jonah, covering his shoulders, then tilted her head as if checking whether he was warm enough. Satisfied, she turned and padded back to her room. Ren lay still, tears sliding sideways into her hair. At the end of the hall, Cale stood with coffee in his hand. He had seen it too. "She's taking care of someone else," Ren whispered a few minutes later, eyes still red. Cale nodded, because she finally has someone taking care of her. The envelope arrived in the morning, thick, cream-colored, embossed with the gold seal of the Supreme Court of New York, and it sat on the penthouse kitchen island like an unexploded bomb. Cale looked at it without opening it. He did not need to. He knew where it came from before he read the sender's name, because in his world, expensive legal paper came from only two places: an enemy who wanted him dead, or someone who once loved him and now wanted to take the thing he loved most. He opened it. Camille Devereaux. An emergency petition for full custody. Grounds stated that the father was unstable, that he exposed the child to unqualified individuals of unclear background, that the living environment was unsuitable for a child with special needs. Cale finished reading. He set the papers down. His first instinct was not to call his lawyer. It was to grip the edge of the marble counter until his knuckles blanched, his jaw locking tight, his eyes darkening in a way Frank Mercer had seen hundreds of times before someone paid for it. Frank stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Cale, looked at the papers, understood immediately. "Do not," he said, his voice firm. "Do not handle this the way you handle Volkov." Cale looked at him. "She disappeared for 3 years. Not one call, not one letter, not $1 in support. And now she comes back because she hears the girl is doing better, and because she hears there is a cleaning woman inside your penthouse with her daughter," Frank replied. "Her lawyer will use that." Cale said nothing, but his hand loosened from the counter, and Ren, standing at the end of the hallway having heard every word, realized that for the first time since she had met Cale Ashford, he was afraid in a way no bullet had ever made him afraid. Afraid of losing Poppy. Ren left the penthouse early that morning to give Cale space to speak with his attorney. She stepped out of the elevator into the lobby and stopped short. A woman stood in the center of the marble floor, beautiful in the way money creates and discipline maintains. Honey blonde hair sleek and straight. A camel coat that fell below the knee. Heels. Ren noticed the heels before she truly registered the face. The sharp rhythm against marble was so familiar it sent a chill through her, because it was the sound Poppy feared. Camille Devereaux held a cup of coffee in her hand. Her fingers trembled. Slightly, but Ren saw it, because she had spent a lifetime noticing the details others ignored. "You are the cleaning woman," Camille said. Her voice was cold, but not steady, like a sheet of glass that looks solid until a single crack shatters it. Ren studied her. The heels, the trembling hand, the eyes that were the same color as Poppy's yet missing the stillness Poppy carried. "And you are the mother who left?" Ren answered. Camille blinked fast, as if struck, but she did not step back. "You know nothing about me. I know Poppy panics at the sound of high heels," Ren said quietly. "I know she draws 3 people, but never 4. I know she remembers your favorite color, but not your voice." Camille set the coffee down on the reception desk. Her hand shook harder now. "Do you think I wanted to leave?" she said, and her voice shifted, less cold, more fractured, as if a layer of armor had been peeled away to reveal the wound beneath. "I sat with her every day, every single day, for 2 years. I sang, I read, I held her, and she looked straight through me as if I were glass. 2 years without one glance into my eyes. Do you know what that feels like? To be erased by the child you gave birth to." Ren did not answer immediately, because she did know. Not with a child, but with the world. 15 years in the foster system. 15 years being looked through instead of looked at. Written into files instead of called by name. Existing without being seen. "I did not leave because I hated her," Camille continued, her voice smaller now, her eyes red though no tears fell. "Because she had clearly learned long ago how to hold them back. I left because she did not need me. She did not look at me. She did not respond. I felt rejected by my own daughter, and I was not strong enough to survive that." Silence settled between them. The lobby was empty. Morning light streamed through glass and fell across the marble floor between two women. One in a $1,000 coat, one in a $3 white shirt from a thrift store, both carrying wounds no one could see. "She does need you," Ren said at last, her voice softer now because she understood that the woman in front of her was not a monster. She was a frightened mother, hurt by her child's silence, who chose to run instead of endure. Wrong, but not evil. She just does not know how to say it. And you did not have the patience to wait. Camille held Ren's gaze for a long moment. Then she asked, almost in a whisper, "How long can you wait?" "As long as it takes," Ren said. "I waited my whole life for a family. So yes, I know how to wait." Camille looked down at her heels, the heels Poppy feared, the heels KL had banned from the penthouse, the heels that were the last sound her daughter heard before her mother disappeared. "Take care of her," Camille said without lifting her head, her voice threaded with surrender, envy, and pain. "Better than I did." Then she turned and walked away, the sharp click of her heels fading across marble until the lobby doors closed, and the silence returned as if she had never been there. That night in the penthouse kitchen, Ren told KL everything. He leaned against the counter, jaw tight, eyes shadowed. "She left for 3 years and now she files for custody." "She is not entirely cruel," Ren said. KL looked at her. "You are defending her." "I am not defending anyone. I understand her. She left because she was afraid, because being rejected every day by her own child broke her." Ren paused, then added gently but with an edge that did not waver. "You left too, into your empire, into that sealed room with Frank, into midnight phone calls in Russian. The only difference is you left while staying in the same house." Kale did not argue, not because he did not want to, because she was right. The courtroom smelled of old leather, stale coffee, and fear. The kind of fear that cannot be seen but settles thickly into the walls, into the oak benches, into the faces of everyone seated inside, because all of them understood that the outcome of this morning would decide where a 5-year-old girl would sleep tonight. Poppy sat in the public gallery wearing blue, the sweater Ren had chosen at dawn, because blue was safety, blue was calm, blue was the language the child trusted. Her right hand held Jonah's. He sat beside her with his back straight, glasses pushed up the bridge of his nose, his injured leg folded carefully beneath the bench, and he did not let go of her hand, even though he was trembling. Across the aisle, Camille Devereaux sat with her legal team, gray coat, hair pulled tight into a knot, her makeup flawless in the particular way only very sad people require it to be flawless. Kale sat at his table in a dark suit without a tie, the scar along his temple stark beneath the fluorescent lights. He did not look at Camille. He looked at Poppy. Only Poppy. Camille's attorney rose first, tall, silver-haired, his voice smooth and precise as a blade slicing paper. "Your Honor, my client has grave concerns about the environment in which her daughter is currently being raised. Mr. Ashford has permitted a woman without clinical credentials, without professional licensing, with a documented history of violence in foster care records, to have ongoing and unsupervised contact with a child who has special needs." He opened a file. Ren Calloway. Foster system. 4 placements. Documented violent behavior at age 15. No college degree. Occupation, cleaning staff. He looked up. "Miss Calloway, I have only one question. Who are you to interfere in this child's life?" The courtroom went still. Ren sat in the witness chair in her $3 white shirt, hands resting on her knees, spine straight. She looked at the attorney, then at the judge, then at Camille, the woman she had faced in the lobby, the woman with the high heels Poppy feared and the eyes the same color as her daughter's. "I am the one who stayed," Ren said. Her voice was not loud, not trembling, not sharp. It was simply true, the kind of truth that costs a lifetime to earn the right to speak. "I grew up without anyone staying. I entered the system at 6. 4 homes. No one kept me long enough for me to remember the smell of their house. At 14, I was beaten for protecting another child. At 15, I slept on the street. I know exactly how heavy absence is, because I carried it on my back every day for 21 years before I met Jonah." She looked at Camille. "You love your daughter. I believe that. I saw it in your eyes in the lobby that day. But when love leaves," she paused. "The child remembers the leaving." Camille did not look at her. She stared at her own hands. Ren turned back to the judge. "I do not have a degree. I do not have a license. I clean floors for a living. But I know something no diploma can teach. Because I learned it in my own skin. She drew a breath. Sometimes the most therapeutic thing you can do for a child is stay. Kael's attorney stood then, composed and methodical, presenting document after document. Legal guardianship papers for Jonah Calloway, duly signed by the court. Ren Calloway recognized as his lawful guardian. Criminal record, none. No convictions. The notation of violence at 15. Self-defense while protecting a younger child from an abusive guardian. Police report confirming. No charges filed. Progress reports for Poppy Ashford over the previous 4 weeks. Documented improvement in communication. Stabilized eating patterns. Social interaction with 2 consistent figures. Use of color language. The judge read each page. Expression unreadable. Then a soft murmur stirred in the gallery. Jonah stood up, 8 years old, walking with a limp, glasses slightly crooked, his hand still holding Poppy's until he had to release it to step forward. The judge looked down at him. "What would you like to say, son?" Jonah pushed his glasses higher. He swallowed. Then he told a story, because that was how Jonah Calloway spoke truth, not with argument but with fairy tales. "Sir, I know a story about a princess who lived in a glass tower. She could see everyone outside, but no one could see her, because glass swallows voices, because glass is clear, but it is still a wall." He paused, swallowed again. Then one day a girl came. Not a princess, not a knight, just an ordinary girl. She did not knock. She did not shout. She did not try to break the glass. She just sat outside the tower, every day, every day, every day. He looked at Poppy, and one day the princess opened the window, not because the ordinary girl was beautiful or rich or special, but because the ordinary girl did not leave. He faced the judge. "Poppy is the princess. My sister is the ordinary girl, and we are not leaving." The courtroom fell utterly silent. The silver-haired attorney stared at his desk. Camille bowed her head. In the gallery, Poppy reached out and touched the empty space beside her where Jonah had been sitting, as if saving it for his return. Publicly, clearly, before the court. The judge was quiet for a long time. He looked at the files, at Poppy, at Jonah limping back to his seat, at Ren, at Kael, at Camille. Then he ruled. Poppy Ashford would remain with her father, Kael Ashford. Camille Devereaux would be granted supervised visitation upon completion of a comprehensive psychological evaluation. Ren Calloway would continue her supportive role with the consent of the father and under professional oversight. The gavel struck. Murmurs rose. Cameras clicked. None of the 4 heard any of it. Poppy turned to Kael. She looked at her father and spoke in a small but steady voice. A voice that had hidden for nearly 2 years and was now releasing its words like soap bubbles into the air. "Stay blue." Kael looked at his daughter. His eyes were red, his jaw tight, but his voice did not shake when he answered. Because this was a promise, and Kael Ashford did not make promises he would not keep. Always. The photograph was taken from a distance, through a fence, blurred yet sharp enough to kill. Ren and Kael stood in the small rooftop garden of the penthouse in the late afternoon, washed in gold from the setting sun. Both were barefoot on the artificial grass. Ren was laughing, her brown hair lifted gently by the wind, and Kael's hand was touching hers, only briefly, only fingers brushing fingers, but the lens had captured it. Behind them on the glass wall hung one of Poppy's paintings, slightly crooked, bursting with color, and beneath it in crayon the words read, "Home is when no one leaves." The article went live at 7:42 in the morning. The headline stretched in bold across the front page of a tabloid, "Crime Lord Ashford brought down by a cleaning woman." By 8 o'clock it had spread across the internet. By 8:15 it was no longer just the photograph. Someone had dug deeper. Someone with money and access and motive had turned page after page of Ren Calloway's foster care file and laid it open to the public, like a fish cut open on a market table. Violent past, no degree, once homeless. Who was the woman beside Kael Ashford? Ren read the article on her phone in the penthouse bathroom, sitting on the edge of the bathtub with the door locked. She read every line. The first line named her, Ren Calloway, 27 years old, night shift cleaning staff at Ashford Holdings. The first cut. The next line referenced foster care records noting violent behavior at age 15. The second cut, deeper, because they did not write that she had shielded a 4-year-old child, did not write that the bottle shattered against her arm instead of her breaking it herself. The next line described nights in subway stations and shelters, no professional qualifications. Raising a child not her own who until recently had no legal guardianship in place. Line after line. Each sentence a blade reopening wounds she had spent 27 years stitching closed. Each line exposing what she had buried not out of shame but because it hurt. Because whenever people looked at her past, they did not see the child who survived. They saw a file. They did not see a scar. They saw violent history. They did not see a 16-year-old girl working 3 jobs to afford a closet-sized room. They saw no degree. She turned the phone off and set it on the edge of the tub. She looked at her hands, rough from